Chapter 1. The seed is planted. It was a world full of contradictions, a vast empire held together by fragile threads of power. The year was 1870, and in a small town called Simbirsk, perched on the banks of the mighty Volga River, a child was born. His name, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. His birth came in the shadow of an empire, the Russian Empire, a land where the rich held all the power and the poor struggled to survive. His father, Ilya Ulyanov, was not like the other noblemen of the time. No, Ilya believed in something different. He was an educator, a man of learning, a man who thought Russia could be saved, not by force, but by reform. Education, he thought, could change the world. But change, it seemed, came too slowly in Russia. Too many stood in the way. The Tsar's power was absolute, his rule unquestioned, and those who dared to speak out were silenced. Young Vladimir, with his sharp eyes and curious mind, grew up surrounded by books and ideas, a mind fed by conversations at his family's dinner table. His mother, Maria Alexandrovna, was a woman of deep faith, but also a woman with a mind as sharp as any blade. She ensured that her children, every single one of them, would grow up to question the world, to challenge it, to change it. And yet, no matter how warm the fire burned in their home, no matter how loving his parents were, outside those walls, Russia remained cold, harsh, and unjust. The whispers of revolution, of rebellion, began to find their way into the minds of the Ulyanov children. Even at a young age, Vladimir felt the weight of his country's suffering. The peasants who had nothing, the workers who slaved away, the people who lived in fear of the Tsar's cruel regime. But then, everything changed. The year was 1887. The Ulyanov family sat together, as they often did, sharing stories, discussing the day's events, when a knock at the door shattered their peace. The news was as shocking as it was devastating. Vladimir's older brother, Alexander, known as Sasha to those who loved him, had been arrested. Arrested for treason. Sasha was not just a student. No. Sasha was more than that. He was a radical, a young man who, like so many others, had become fed up with the Tsar's rule. And in his frustration, in his desire to see a better world, he had plotted to assassinate the Tsar, to strike at the very heart of the empire. But he was caught. Vladimir's world, cracked open. The shock of it, the horror, was too much to bear. His brother, his hero, was sentenced to death. In a single moment, Vladimir's life changed forever. He was only 17, just a boy, really. But that day, something deep inside him snapped. When Sasha was executed, hanged by the very empire he sought to destroy, Vladimir's heart turned cold. His grief was deep, but his anger was deeper still. He stood, staring into the abyss that had swallowed his brother, and in that moment, a fire was lit inside him, a fire that would never die. "The Tsar must fall," he whispered, clutching his fists so tight they turned white. "The Tsar must fall." And with those words, the seed of revolution was planted. His grief would not consume him. No, it would fuel him. The injustice that took his brother's life would become the very force that drove him forward. But he was not ready yet. The storm was brewing inside him, yes, but he needed time. Time to learn, to grow, to gather strength. He returned to his studies, but everything felt different. The world no longer seemed like a place of possibilities. It felt broken. And only radical change could fix it. As he pored over the works of Marx, the writings of the great revolutionary thinkers, something began to take shape in Vladimir's mind. He wasn't looking for reform. No, reform wasn't enough. He wanted something more. He wanted to tear down the old world and build something entirely new from the ashes. Vladimir, now burning with a new purpose, became more focused than ever. His studies became an obsession. Politics, economics, history. He devoured everything he could find. He wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for a plan, a way to take down the system that had killed his brother and crushed so many others under its boot. He began to see that Russia didn't need a gentle nudge toward progress. No, it needed revolution. A violent, unstoppable force that would sweep away the old order and make way for something entirely new. The days of playing by the rules were over. He could see it now, clearer than ever. Revolution wasn't just an idea. It was a necessity. It was the only way to end the suffering, to bring justice to the people. But how? How would he, a young man from a small town, lead such a monumental change? The question haunted him, but it also drove him. He wasn't ready yet, but he would be. Soon enough, he would be. His brother had given his life for the cause, and Vladimir would not let that sacrifice be in vain. A plan was forming. The walls of his family home no longer seemed like a place of comfort. They felt like a prison, holding him back. He wanted, needed to escape, to get out into the world, to find others like him, to find the people who were ready to take action, to find his comrades, his allies in the coming storm. And so, young Vladimir left Simbirsk. His path was uncertain, but his destination was clear. He would fight, he would rise, and he would not stop until the Tsar's regime crumbled and a new world was born from its ashes. The revolution had already begun in his heart, but soon it would ignite in the streets of Russia. The boy from Simbirsk was gone. In his place, a revolutionary was being born. Chapter 2. A Storm Brews Within. Vladimir stood at the edge of his brother's grave, staring into the cold earth. His fists clenched, his jaw tight. Grief twisted inside him, yes, but what burned even brighter now was rage. A deep, seething anger that rippled through his entire being. Alexander's death wasn't just a loss. It was an injustice, and this would not stand. The Tsar had taken his brother. But Vladimir swore, standing there, heart pounding, that he would not be broken. "I will not forget," he whispered, voice trembling, but fierce. "I will carry on his fight. I will finish what he started." The winds were shifting inside him, growing stronger with each passing day. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and soon they would sprout into something far more dangerous. He returned to his studies, but how could he focus? The books that once fascinated him now seemed dull, lifeless. His mind was elsewhere. Kazan University, with its orderly halls and proper discussions, was too small for the ideas surging through his head. His focus had shifted from education to revolution. It was in these quiet moments that he turned to the works of Karl Marx. There, in the dense pages of Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, Vladimir found the answers he had been seeking, or at least, the beginnings of them. Marx's words spoke of class struggle, of the workers rising up to overthrow their oppressors. The world Marx described, one of revolution, of a new social order, thrilled Vladimir. It was no longer about reforming the system. No, it was about destroying it. In the evenings, After long hours buried in books, Vladimir would pace his room. His thoughts were racing. Revolution. It was no longer a distant dream, it was a necessity. And yet he could feel it, in every step, every breath. It wasn't just an idea to him. It was something alive, something that pulsed and grew with each passing day. Reform is a lie, he would mutter under his breath. We need revolution. Nothing else will change this broken world. But Kazan University, with its strict rules and outdated thinking, was no place for a mind like Vladimir's. He began speaking out more, passionately, daringly. His ideas, radical, powerful, began to catch the attention of others. Students gathered to listen to him, their eyes wide with wonder, but also fear. He wasn't just talking about ideas anymore, he was talking about action. It wasn't long before the authorities noticed him too. His professors frowned. His fellow students grew nervous. Whispers followed him down the hallways. Trouble was brewing, and Vladimir was at the center of it. The university. They saw him as a threat, and in a country ruled by fear, by control, there was no place for threats. One morning it happened. He was called into the headmaster's office. The room was cold, the air tense. Vladimir stood, tall, defiant, as the headmaster spoke. You are no longer welcome here, Ulyanov. Your ideas, your behavior, they're dangerous. You are expelled. Expelled? Vladimir didn't flinch. If anything, a small, cold smile crept onto his lips. This wasn't a punishment. No, this was the beginning of his freedom. The walls of Kazan University could no longer hold him, could no longer contain the storm brewing inside him. And so, he left. The streets of Kazan became his classroom now. He wandered, hungry, not for food, but for knowledge, for ideas, for allies. He found other radicals, young men and women like himself, full of hope, anger, and the desire for change. They met in secret, in dimly lit rooms, where every word spoken felt like a spark, a flame ready to ignite. Each conversation, each whispered plan, brought Vladimir closer to his vision. He was no longer just a student. He was becoming something more. The streets, the people, the unrest. It was all fuel for the fire growing within him. He could see it now. The revolution was coming. It wasn't a matter of if anymore, but when. But Russia was still quiet for now. The Tsar's grip remained strong. The people were suffering, yes, but their cries were whispered, not shouted. Vladimir could feel the tension in the air, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Revolution, he thought, was in the wind. It was coming, but it needed someone to lead it. The question haunted him. Could he be that someone? Could he be the one to gather the people, to spark the fire, to lead the charge against the empire? The thought thrilled him and terrified him, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not stop. Not now. Not ever. Every step he took, every word he spoke, every idea that burned in his mind, it all brought him closer to his destiny. The grief he had felt over his brother's death had transformed into something far more powerful. The anger that had once consumed him now fueled him. His path was set. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets, Vladimir stood on a hill overlooking the city. The wind whipped around him, cold and sharp. He stared out at the buildings, the factories, the homes, and he could almost hear the whispers of the people, their suffering, their pain, their hopes. He clenched his fists, breathing deeply, his heart pounding in his chest. "The time is coming," he whispered. "The Tsar doesn't know it yet, but his days are numbered." A storm was brewing, and it was only a matter of time before it broke. Chapter 3. The Making of a Revolutionary. Exiled to the quiet countryside. It wasn't a prison cell, but to Vladimir Ulyanov it felt just as confining. After his expulsion from university, the young revolutionary found himself back at his family's estate, a place filled with memories of his childhood, of simpler times. But now it felt suffocating. The stillness, the calm. It mocked him. How could he rest here, in this tranquil place, when the world beyond these hills was in chaos? How could he stay silent when the storm of revolution was swirling inside him? Vladimir wandered the estate, pacing back and forth, back and forth. The long, empty fields stretched out before him, but his mind was far away, in the streets of St. Petersburg, in the bustling factories, in the cramped homes where people starved while the Tsar dined in palaces. His thoughts raced, fueled by anger, frustration, and ambition. He retreated to his room, where a mountain of books awaited him: history, politics, philosophy. He devoured every word, as if each page held the secret to revolution. He studied the revolutions of the past, the storming of the Bastille in France, the fight for independence in America. He analyzed them, dissected them, learned from them, and in every revolution, in every struggle for freedom, he saw a reflection of Russia, his Russia. But it wasn't enough to read about revolutions. Vladimir dreamed of leading one. "Russia will rise," he would mutter to himself, pacing faster, his eyes burning with intensity. It must. His mind was sharp, his determination unshakable. And yet, here he was, trapped in the isolation of the countryside. It wasn't the government keeping him here. It was his own circumstance, his own exile. But he would not waste time. No. Even in this quiet prison, he would prepare. He would arm himself with knowledge, with ideas, with the fuel for the fire he would soon set ablaze. And so he gathered newspapers, letters, pamphlets smuggled from the cities. He read them all with a hunger that never seemed to fade. He studied Marx's writings with a zeal that bordered on obsession. The idea of class struggle, of the working class rising to overthrow their oppressors, it spoke to him, called to him, and transformed him. These weren't just ideas on paper. This was the path forward. This was the way to tear down the empire that had taken his brother's life, that had oppressed millions for centuries. Revolution was not just a dream, it was a necessity. In the evenings, when the house was quiet, Vladimir would write, his pen scratching feverishly against the paper, as if the act of writing itself was a kind of battle. His ideas poured out of him, fierce, unrelenting. "The Tsar's regime," he wrote, "is a disease, and revolution is the cure." He wrote pamphlets, manifestos, letters to like-minded thinkers. But his words were not meant to be read in silence. They were meant to be heard in the streets, to echo through the factories, to fuel the workers' anger, to fan the flames of rebellion. But Vladimir knew he couldn't do it alone. He began to reach out, cautiously at first, to others like him, young men and women who shared his vision, who saw, as he did, that Russia was on the edge of something monumental. He made connections, quietly, carefully. In dimly lit rooms, behind closed doors, they would gather. Small groups at first, Marxists, idealists, dreamers. They would speak in hushed voices for fear of being overheard. The walls had ears, after all, and the Tsar's secret police were never far away. But that didn't stop them. In these secret meetings, Vladimir found something more than comrades. He found allies. Every conversation was a spark. Every idea an explosion in his mind. They spoke of revolution, yes, but also of tactics, of strategy. They discussed not just the why, but the how. How would they rise? How would they overthrow a regime that had ruled with an iron fist for centuries? And as they spoke, as they planned, Vladimir's mind raced ahead, always thinking, always pushing forward. He was no longer content to be a follower, no longer content to be just another voice in the crowd. He wanted more. He needed more. His ambition had grown. He wasn't just Vladimir Ulyanov, a restless young man from the countryside. No, he was becoming something else. Something larger. Lenin. It started as a whisper, a name chosen not for its sound, but for its meaning. A name that would hide his identity, yes, but also one that would become a symbol of the revolution itself. Lenin. The name echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing day. Soon, others began to call him by this name, and with it, he felt a shift, a transformation. He was no longer just the man he had been before. He was becoming the leader he was meant to be. As the months passed, his writings spread, his influence grew. More and more people began to gather, to listen, to follow. His ideas were no longer just whispers in secret rooms. They were spreading like wildfire. And with every new follower, with every new believer in the cause, Lenin grew stronger. But he knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous. The Tsar's regime was vast, powerful, and merciless. The secret police, the military, the nobility, they all stood in the way. But Lenin was undeterred. The revolution was coming. It was inevitable. The only question now was, when? He could feel it, the tension in the air, the unrest in the cities, the whispers of rebellion growing louder. The storm was no longer just inside him. It was all around him. And soon, very soon, it would break. Lenin stood at the edge of the estate, staring out at the darkening horizon. The quiet countryside that had once mocked him now felt like the calm before the storm. He took a deep breath, his mind already far away, in the streets of Russia, where the people, his people, were waiting for a leader. "I am ready," he whispered to himself, his voice low but steady. "The world will know my name, and they will never forget it." And with that, Lenin turned and walked back toward the house, the future already unfolding in his mind, a future filled with revolution, power, and a new Russia rising from the ashes of the old. Chapter 4. The Rise of Lenin. In the dim glow of a flickering candle, in the shadow of oppression, he became something more. The man known as Vladimir Ulyanov was fading away, and in his place, Lenin emerged. The name itself was a weapon. Sharp, precise, chosen with care. It wasn't just a disguise, it was a symbol of revolution, of defiance, of everything he would soon stand for. But in these early days, Lenin was a whisper, a murmur passed between revolutionaries, a secret known only to those closest to him. The world hadn't yet heard that name, but it would. And when they did, the world would never forget it. In the quiet of his small, dimly lit room, Lenin bent over his desk, papers scattered before him, ink stains on his fingers. He wrote furiously, endlessly. Pamphlets, essays, articles, each one filled with radical ideas that, if spoken aloud, could get him arrested or worse. But the risk didn't matter to Lenin. No, In his hands, the written word was a weapon, and he wielded it like a master swordsman. Every sentence was crafted with intent, every paragraph a challenge to the Tsarist regime that had ruled with an iron fist for far too long. "The workers must rise," he wrote, his pen scratching across the page. "The peasants must unite. Only then can we tear down the walls of this oppressive empire." The candle flickered, as if it, too, was trembling under the power of his words. He knew his writings were dangerous. He knew the Tsar's secret police were always watching, waiting, ready to crush any sign of rebellion. But Lenin didn't care. He had no choice now. He was a man possessed, driven by something far greater than himself. His brother's death, the suffering of the Russian people, the weight of history itself pressed down on his shoulders. But he welcomed it. This pressure, this danger, it fueled him. His writing spread slowly at first, passed hand to hand, in dark alleys, in factory back rooms, in workers' taverns where tired men and women gathered after long days of endless toil. They read his words, and they listened. "This Lenin," they whispered, "he speaks the truth." And it wasn't just the workers who were listening, the intellectuals, the students, the radical thinkers. They too were drawn to Lenin's vision. He was becoming a voice for the voiceless, a leader for the leaderless. And yet, in the shadows, he remained. His identity still hidden, his plan still unfolding. But Lenin was patient. He knew his time would come, but not yet. He needed to wait, to build, to prepare. He met with fellow revolutionaries in secret, always cautious, always watching. In dark, smoke-filled rooms they gathered, faces hidden in the gloom, voices low. They planned, they argued, they dreamed of a new Russia, a Russia free from the chains of the Tsar. And at the center of it all was Lenin. His mind worked like a machine, constantly analyzing, strategizing, thinking of every move like a game of chess. "We need the people," he would say, his voice steady but firm. "Without the workers, without the peasants, we are nothing. We must make them see that their strength is greater than the Tsar's armies, greater than any empire." And they listened. Lenin spoke not just with words, but with conviction. Every sentence carried weight, every idea struck deep. His comrades, his allies, began to see him not just as a thinker, but as a leader, a man who could truly change the course of history. But Lenin knew. Words were not enough. Not yet. He needed to spread his message farther, to reach more people. The Tsar's grip on the country was slipping, yes, but it was still strong enough to crush any hint of rebellion. Lenin needed to be strategic. He began writing for underground newspapers, distributing pamphlets on a wider scale. His name, his new name, was starting to be recognized. Lenin. It was no longer just a whisper. It was growing louder, a rumble in the distance, the first signs of the storm that was coming. As his influence grew, so did the danger. The Tsar's secret police were always close behind, always searching for this mysterious Lenin who was stirring up trouble. But Lenin was careful. He moved from place to place, always one step ahead. His writings, his meetings, his plans, all carried out in the shadows where the eyes of the regime couldn't reach. At least, not yet. But even in this constant state of danger, Lenin remained focused. His ambition, his vision for the future, it drove him forward. The Tsarist regime was teetering on the edge of collapse, and Lenin knew it. But would it be enough? Would the people rise when the time came? Would they be ready to fight? To overthrow the empire that had ruled for so long? And what about him? Could he lead them? Could one man truly change the course of history? These questions gnawed at him in the quiet moments, but only for a brief flicker. Doubt had no place in his mind, not now. The revolution was bigger than him. It was inevitable, unstoppable. It was coming. As the weeks turned into months, Lenin's network of allies grew. The workers, the peasants, the intellectuals, they were all starting to see the cracks in the Tsar's empire. They could feel the tension in the air, the unrest simmering beneath the surface. And Lenin was there, fanning the flames, pushing the movement forward. He began to speak more openly now. His words, once confined to the pages of secret pamphlets, were starting to reach larger audiences. Small meetings turned into larger gatherings. And with every word, with every speech, Lenin's power grew. "The Tsar's days are numbered," he would say, his voice rising with intensity. "The people are waking up, and when they rise, the empire will fall." The crowd would cheer, their fists raised high, their voices echoing through the room. And Lenin, he would stand tall, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The revolution wasn't just a dream anymore. It was real. It was coming. But for now, he would wait. He would watch. He would prepare. Chapter 5. The Fire of Revolution. Russia, a land of contradictions, a country vast beyond imagination, stretching from Europe to the depths of Asia, rich in resources, in land, in history. But beneath the surface, there was something far darker. The people, the workers, the peasants, millions of them, were starving, suffering, barely surviving. The rich lived in luxury, feasting on the labor of the poor. The gap between the haves and the have-nots was growing wider every day. The Tsar ruled with absolute power, but that power was cracking. And Lenin saw it all. The empire was rotting from the inside. The people were angry, restless. Tension bubbled just beneath the surface, like a pot about to boil over. And Lenin, with his sharp mind and burning ambition, knew that the moment was coming. The fire of revolution was about to ignite. He traveled to St. Petersburg, the beating heart of the empire. The city was alive with energy, with unrest, with the sound of voices rising up in protest. The workers, exhausted from endless hours in factories, were demanding rights. They marched through the streets, fists raised, voices hoarse from shouting. "We need change!" they cried. "We need justice!" Lenin stood at the edge of the crowd, watching, his heart pounding with excitement. This was it. The revolution he had dreamed of, the revolution he had promised himself, was coming to life before his eyes. The workers were rising. The people were waking up. But as Lenin watched the marching crowds, he knew one thing for certain. It wasn't just enough to rise up. It wasn't just enough to shout for change. They needed direction. They needed leadership. They needed him. Lenin had to lead. There were other voices in the streets of St. Petersburg, other revolutionaries, each with their own vision for the future. The Social Democrats, the Mensheviks, the anarchists, all fighting for control, for influence, for a place at the head of the revolution. The question was, could Lenin unite them? Could he be the one to lead this fractured, desperate movement? The tension in the streets was electric. Everywhere Lenin turned, there were strikes, protests, secret meetings held in the shadows of the factories. Workers met in small, dimly lit rooms, whispering of revolution, of overthrowing the Tsar, of power for the people. And Lenin? He was in the middle of it all, his mind spinning with plans, strategies, ideas. But even as the workers marched, even as they demanded change, the Tsar's regime stood firm. The police, the military, the secret spies, Lenin knew they were watching, waiting, ready to crush the revolution before it even had a chance to begin. Lenin had to be careful, very careful. One wrong move, and everything could be lost. Still, the fire in his chest wouldn't go out. Every shout, every chant of the workers only fueled him more. This wasn't just a moment of hope. It was a moment of destiny. Lenin's moment. In the secret meetings he held with his comrades, Lenin's voice was clear, steady, but full of intensity. "The people are ready," he would say, his eyes burning with passion. "The revolution is here, but we must guide it. We must be prepared. We need a plan." He wasn't just talking about rebellion. He was talking about something far more dangerous, far more powerful. He was talking about a complete, total overthrow of the system. Not just a change of rulers, but a change of everything. Society, power, the very foundations of Russia. "We can't just settle for reform," Lenin argued. "Reform will only bandage the wound. We need to rip out the cause. We need to destroy the old system and build a new one from its ashes." His comrades listened, some nodding in agreement, others hesitating, uncertain. There were so many voices in the revolution, so many paths it could take. But Lenin was determined. He didn't just want to be a part of history, he wanted to make history. As the weeks passed, the unrest in the city grew. Workers walked out of factories, peasants refused to work the land, students filled the streets with banners and chants. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. Lenin could feel it. The air was thick with tension, with the possibility of something monumental. The Tsar's regime was crumbling, but it wasn't gone yet. The power of the empire was still vast, and Lenin knew the fight ahead would be brutal. But he was ready. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life. One night, as Lenin stood on the edge of a crowded street, watching the workers march by, his mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. He looked around, at the faces of the people. The anger in their eyes, the determination in their steps. These were the people he had been waiting for. These were the people who would overthrow the Tsar, and who would look to him to lead them. But could he? Could one man, one revolutionary, truly change the course of history? He had to. In the quiet of his small room, Lenin continued to write. Pamphlets, articles, essays, each one filled with his vision for a new Russia. His words were more than just ink on paper. They were weapons, sharp and dangerous, meant to cut through the lies of the regime and ignite the fire of revolution in the hearts of the people. "The time for waiting is over," he wrote, his pen moving swiftly across the page. "The time for action is here. The workers, the peasants, the people of Russia, they are ready. We must seize this moment. We must unite, and we must fight for the future we deserve." But even as Lenin's words spread, as more and more people began to whisper his name, he knew that the revolution would not be easy. The Tsar's grip on power was loosening, yes, but it was still strong enough to crush any uprising if given the chance. Lenin had to be smart, strategic. He had to bring the revolutionaries together to form a single, unstoppable force. That was the challenge. So many voices, so many ideas, all pulling in different directions. But Lenin believed, with every fiber of his being, that he could do it. That he could lead them, guide them, unite them under his banner. As the fires of revolution burned brighter, as the streets of St. Petersburg filled with more protests, more strikes, more unrest, Lenin stood at the center of it all, his eyes fixed on the future. He could feel it in his bones. The Tsar's empire was falling, and soon, very soon, it would crumble. And when it did, Lenin would be there, ready to take the reins of history, to lead the people into a new world, a new Russia. The fire of revolution had been lit, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 6. The struggle begins. Revolution doesn't come easily. The streets of Russia were filled with whispers of change, the tension almost unbearable. The workers, the peasants, the intellectuals, they were all talking, planning, preparing. But the Tsar, he was watching, and he was ready to strike back. The air in St. Petersburg was heavy, thick with the smell of fear. The revolutionaries could feel it. Lenin could feel it. The Tsar's grip on power was slipping, but the empire wasn't about to let go without a fight. And when power begins to slip, that's when it's most dangerous. The Tsar's response was swift, brutal. Secret police, arrests, disappearances. The streets echoed with the heavy footsteps of soldiers and the clanging of prison doors slamming shut. The revolutionaries who had once marched so boldly now had to look over their shoulders with every step. Fear ruled the streets. It was everywhere. And yet, Lenin was undeterred. He had seen death before. He had felt the cold sting of loss. His brother, Alexander, had been executed by the very regime they now fought against. His own exile, forced away from his dreams, had only steeled his resolve. These were scars he wore like armor. Every scar was a reminder of the battle ahead, and a promise that he would not stop. Not until the Tsar's empire was nothing but a memory. Lenin, sitting at his small desk, surrounded by papers and books, could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. He knew the risks. He knew that at any moment there could be a knock on the door, a knock that could end everything. But still, his hand did not tremble as he wrote. His words grew bolder, more dangerous. "The time is now," he wrote, his pen moving swiftly across the paper. "The chains of oppression must be broken. The workers, the peasants, they have the power. They have the strength. They must rise." Every word felt like a declaration of war. And in a way, it was. Lenin's writing spread like wildfire, passed from hand to hand in secret, smuggled into factories, hidden in the back rooms of taverns. His words were dangerous, but to the workers and peasants, they were a lifeline, a promise of something better, a promise of freedom. But with every word, every pamphlet, every article, Lenin became more than just a writer. He became a threat. The authorities were taking notice. The Tsar's secret police had a list of names, and at the top of that list was Lenin. They had been watching him for months, tracking his movements, his meetings, his words. To them, Lenin was not just a man with dangerous ideas. He was the spark that could ignite the fire they feared most, revolution. The crackdowns began in earnest. Lenin's comrades, his friends, began to disappear. Some were imprisoned, others were never heard from again. The streets were quiet, but beneath the silence, there was a roar waiting to erupt. Would Lenin survive this? Could he continue to fight, to write, to lead? Lenin knew the risks. He knew the authorities were closing in, but what choice did he have? The revolution was bigger than him. It was bigger than any one person. He could not stop now. He would not stop. The workers were depending on him. The peasants were looking to him for guidance. The struggle was only beginning, and Lenin was ready to lead it. But as the walls closed in, Lenin's resolve only grew stronger. He moved in the shadows, slipping through the cracks of the Tsar's crumbling regime. He met with his comrades in secret, whispering plans in the dead of night, plotting the next move. The Tsar's police may have been watching, but Lenin was always one step ahead. Still, the danger was real. Lenin had become a marked man. His name, once whispered only among revolutionaries, was now at the top of every watch list. His face was known, his words were feared, and the Tsar's regime, they wanted him gone. They wanted him silenced. But Lenin's voice, it could not be silenced. Even as his comrades fell around him, even as the weight of the empire bore down on his shoulders, Lenin's writings became more daring, more direct. He called for the workers to rise up, to take control of their own destiny. "The time for waiting is over," he wrote. "The people of Russia will not be ruled by fear any longer. The revolution is coming, and we will lead it." Every word was like a match, striking against the dry kindling of the people's anger. The flames were growing, spreading, unstoppable. And Lenin was the one fanning those flames. But how long could he continue? How long before the Tsar's men came for him? How long before the revolutionaries were crushed under the weight of the empire? Lenin did not allow these thoughts to linger. There was no room for doubt. Not now. Not ever. He had been through too much, lost too much to turn back now. His brother's death, his own exile. These were not the end. They were just the beginning. They had prepared him for this moment, for this struggle. "The revolution," Lenin said to his comrades one night as they gathered in a small hidden room beneath the city, "is not a single event. It is a struggle. And that struggle is just beginning. We cannot stop. We will not stop. The Tsar's regime is falling. It's only a matter of time. We must be ready to rise when it does." His comrades nodded, their faces lit by the dim light of the single candle that flickered in the middle of the room. They knew the risks. They knew the danger. But they also knew that Lenin was right. The struggle had begun. And Lenin, with every word, every speech, every action, was leading the way. He was no longer just a revolutionary in the shadows. He was the leader the people needed. And no matter what the Tsar's regime threw at him, no matter how dangerous it became, Lenin was ready. The streets of St. Petersburg were quiet, for now. But beneath the surface, the fire of revolution burned hotter with each passing day. And Lenin was the flame. Chapter 7. Exile and Return. The knock on the door, it was inevitable. Lenin's revolutionary activities, his fiery writings, his bold defiance of the Tsar's regime, it could no longer be ignored. The authorities were watching, waiting. And finally they came for him. The shadowy figures in the dark of night. The knock that echoed like a warning. A signal that his time in Russia had run out. Exile. Far from Russia, far from the streets where revolution simmered. They thought it would break him. Silence him. But Lenin was not so easily defeated. He fled, slipping away from their grasp, crossing borders until he found himself in Switzerland. A cold, distant land, surrounded by mountains that seemed as impenetrable as the empire he had vowed to overthrow. The revolution, his revolution, felt 1,000,000 miles away. The streets of St. Petersburg were a distant memory, and the people he had sworn to liberate, they were out of reach. But Lenin was never idle. He refused to let the cold winds of exile freeze his ambition. He might have been far from Russia, but his mind, his heart, his purpose, they remained there in the thick of the fight. Exile would not stop him. No. From the quiet hills of Switzerland, he continued to write, to plan, to lead. His pen became his weapon once more. He wrote tirelessly, as if the ink on the page could cross borders, could slip past the Tsar's censors and land in the hands of those who needed it most, the workers, the peasants, the revolutionaries. His words were more than just ideas. They were calls to action. "Revolution is not a dream," he wrote, his hand steady, his eyes burning with intensity. "It is inevitable." But Lenin wasn't just writing for Russia. No, his exile gave him something unexpected. New comrades, far from home, in the cafes and meeting halls of Switzerland, Lenin found men and women from all over the world who shared his vision. Exiles like him, dreamers, radicals, people who believed that the old systems, the old ways, had to be destroyed. He found kindred spirits, people who, like him, were waiting for the moment when revolution would sweep across Europe. They met in secret, their conversations filled with the heat of ideas, the fire of possibility. Lenin's mind raced, always thinking, always strategizing. They weren't just talking about revolution anymore. They were planning it. "The Tsar's days are numbered," Lenin would say, his voice low, steady, but filled with conviction. "We must be ready when the moment comes." And it was there, in the heart of his exile, that Lenin found the people who would help him bring his vision to life. They weren't just comrades. They were followers. Together, they formed a new party. A party of action. A party of revolutionaries who would stop at nothing to see the old world torn apart. The Bolsheviks. This wasn't just a political group. It was a movement, a force that would grow, that would spread, that would one day march through the streets of Russia. Lenin's ambition grew with it. He no longer dreamed of revolution. He knew it was coming. The question wasn't if, but when. Lenin was a man transformed. He had been exiled, yes, but instead of being crushed by it, he became something more. His vision, once focused solely on Russia, expanded. He saw not just the collapse of the Tsar's regime, but the collapse of monarchies, of empires, of capitalist systems across the world. He spoke of a global revolution, a wave that would start in Russia and spread like wildfire. And the Bolsheviks, they would be the ones to ignite it. But still, in the quiet of the Swiss nights, as Lenin stared out at the distant mountains, his mind always returned to Russia, his homeland, the place where it would all begin. He could feel it, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The people were suffering. The workers were growing restless. The cracks in the empire were widening, and Lenin knew. When the moment came, he had to be ready. Exile was not his prison. It was his preparation. And as the months passed, Lenin waited. He continued to write, to plan, to lead from afar. But his thoughts, his heart, remained in Russia. He knew that one day the call would come. One day, the revolution would begin, and when it did, he would return. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. It was 1917. The world was at war. The Russian Empire was crumbling under the weight of its own failures. Soldiers deserted the front lines. The people were starving. The streets of St. Petersburg, once quiet, were now filled with protests, strikes, riots. The empire was falling. Lenin's moment had arrived. From Switzerland, he watched the events unfold, his heart pounding with excitement. This was it. The revolution he had dreamed of, the revolution he had planned for, was finally happening. The Tsar's regime was collapsing, and the people were rising. But Lenin knew it wasn't enough. The revolution needed leadership. It needed direction. It needed him. But how? How would he return to Russia, with the eyes of the authorities still watching, still waiting? How would he get back to the streets where his people needed him most? The answer came in the form of a sealed train. A train that would carry him across the war-torn landscape, through enemy lines, and back to the heart of the empire he had sworn to overthrow. The journey was dangerous, filled with uncertainty. But Lenin didn't care. He had waited years for this moment. Every step, every mile, brought him closer to the revolution he had fought for his entire life. As the train rumbled across the continent, Lenin's mind raced. Plans, strategies, visions of a new Russia. The future was unfolding before him, and he was ready to seize it. When the train finally stopped, and Lenin stepped off onto Russian soil, he knew this was the beginning. The empire was in its final days. The revolution was here. And Lenin had returned to lead it. Chapter 8. The Revolution Ignites. Russia was a nation on the edge. The pressure, after years of oppression, starvation, and war, was reaching its breaking point. The people, once silent, once afraid, were now hungry, tired, and desperate for change. The Tsar's grip on power was weakening with every passing day. And Lenin was watching, waiting, knowing that the moment he had spent his entire life preparing for was finally here. It was 1917, the year everything would change. The streets of Petrograd, once quiet, once controlled, were now alive with the sounds of revolution. Gunshots echoed in the distance, shouts filled the air, and the clattering of boots on the cobblestone streets rang out like thunder. The city was no longer just the heart of the empire. It was now the heart of the revolution. Lenin, still in exile, heard the news. The revolution had begun. The Tsar's regime was crumbling. The protests, the strikes, the riots. They weren't just isolated incidents anymore. They were the spark that would ignite the fire Lenin had always believed in. The revolution was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality. But even as the people of Petrograd rose up, even as the pressure built in the streets, Lenin knew that the fight was far from over. The Tsar was weakening, yes, but the regime, the system, it wouldn't fall so easily. The old world was stubborn. It would fight to survive. And Lenin had to be ready to take control, to lead, to guide this revolution to its final victory. But first, he had to return to Russia. From his exile in Switzerland, Lenin boarded a sealed train. The journey back to Russia was filled with danger, uncertainty, but also excitement. His heart pounded as the train rumbled across Europe, carrying him toward the revolution he had always dreamed of. He could hardly believe it. The moment had come. His moment. And then, as the train pulled into the station, Lenin stepped off. It felt like stepping into history itself. The noise of the station, the crowds, the tension in the air, it all hit him at once. He took a deep breath, his feet finally back on Russian soil, and whispered to himself, "Now it begins." The streets of Petrograd were chaotic. The city was a battleground of ideas, of ideologies, of hope and fear. Workers were striking, soldiers were deserting the front lines, and the people, oh, the people, were everywhere. They filled the streets, their faces tired but determined. They wanted change. They needed change. And Lenin was ready to lead them. But as Lenin made his way through the streets, he knew that this was only the beginning. Yes, the Tsar had abdicated. After centuries of rule, the Romanov dynasty had fallen. The people had forced the Tsar to step down, to surrender his crown, his power. But the fall of the Tsar didn't mean the revolution was over. No, it meant the revolution was just starting. The provisional government, they were the new power in Russia. A government that promised reform, that promised democracy. But Lenin didn't believe their promises. He didn't trust them. He saw them as nothing more than a new face of the old system. To Lenin, reform wasn't enough. Reform was a bandage on a wound that needed to be cut out at its root. Standing before a crowd of workers and soldiers, Lenin's voice rang out with fire, with conviction. "The revolution is not over," he declared, his eyes burning with passion. "The Tsar is gone, but the system that oppressed you, that starved you, that sent your sons to die in the war, is still in place. We cannot settle for half measures. We must continue the fight. We must take power into our own hands." His words, they weren't just speeches, they were commands. And the people, oh, the people, listened. The workers, the soldiers, the peasants, they hung on every word. For years, they had been told to wait, to be patient, to trust in reform. But Lenin was offering them something else. He was offering them action. "The provisional government," Lenin continued, his voice rising, "will not give you what you deserve. Only we, the workers, the people, can take the power that is rightfully ours." His words echoed through the streets, through the hearts of the people who had suffered for so long. And as they listened, as they felt the fire in Lenin's voice, they knew. He was right. The revolution was not over. It had just begun. But the fight ahead was daunting. The provisional government was in power now, and they were not about to let go. There were still soldiers loyal to the old regime. There were still men who believed in the Tsar, who believed in the system. And there were other revolutionaries, other voices, competing for control. The Social Democrats, the Mensheviks, the anarchists, all fighting for their own vision of Russia's future. Lenin knew that he had to be more than just a voice in this revolution. He had to be the voice, the leader, the one who could unite the revolutionaries under one banner, his banner, the banner of the Bolsheviks. The streets of Petrograd were filled with chaos, but Lenin's mind was clear. The provisional government was weak, and he knew. If they were going to take power, they had to act fast. They had to strike before the old system could regroup, before the forces of reaction could crush the revolution. Lenin's writings, his speeches, his plans, they all took on a new urgency. He met with his comrades in secret, planning, plotting, preparing for the next phase of the revolution. The people were with him. He could feel it. The energy in the air was electric, alive with the possibility of change. But time was running out. In the summer of 1917, the streets of Petrograd were once again filled with protests. The people demanded an end to the war, an end to the suffering, an end to the rule of the provisional government. Lenin watched as the protests grew, as the anger boiled over. He knew that the moment to strike was coming, and when it did, Lenin would be ready. The revolution had been ignited, but the true battle, the battle for the future of Russia, was still to come. And Lenin, with his unwavering vision, with his unbreakable determination, would lead that battle. He would guide the people through the storm, through the chaos, through the fire. The revolution was here, and Lenin had returned to lead it. Chapter 9. October, the coup. It was October, and the air in Petrograd felt different, heavy, thick with the kind of tension that comes before a storm. The provisional government, weak and trembling, clung desperately to power, but even they knew their days were numbered. The streets were restless, the factories silent, the people waiting. And Lenin? Lenin was ready. For months he had watched, planned, waited. The revolution had begun, but it wasn't finished. The provisional government was a false promise, reform without real change, a new face for the same old system. Lenin knew that for the revolution to truly succeed, the people, the workers, the Bolsheviks, had to seize control. The plan was simple. It had to be. Too much was at stake, and the window of opportunity was closing. The heart of the government, the Winter Palace, grand and imposing, was their target. If they could take it, if they could strike in one swift, decisive blow, the old order would crumble. The Bolsheviks would rise. And so, the night came. A cold October night, the streets shrouded in darkness, but the city itself, alive. The sound of boots marching, the clink of rifles being loaded, the low rumble of tanks crawling through the streets. The people holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. The provisional government, hidden behind the walls of the Winter Palace, surrounded by a few loyal troops, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. Lenin stood in the shadows, watching as the final pieces of his plan came into place. His face was calm, but inside, his heart beat with the force of history itself. He had waited for this moment, his entire life. All the speeches, all the writings, all the sacrifices had led to this. The old world, the one that had crushed his people, that had killed his brother, that had forced him into exile. It was about to fall. His comrades, the Bolshevik soldiers, looked to him for guidance, for leadership, and Lenin gave it. "Tonight," he whispered, his voice steady, filled with determination, "we take what is rightfully ours. The provisional government is weak, and the people are with us. The time for talk is over. The time for action is now." The signal was given, and like a wave crashing on the shore, the Bolsheviks surged forward. The night erupted with the sounds of revolution. The crack of rifles, the deafening roar of tanks, the sharp cries of soldiers charging toward the Winter Palace. Lenin could feel the energy coursing through the streets, the unstoppable force of a people rising up against their oppressors. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. The provisional government, huddled together, could hear the sound of gunfire growing louder, the footsteps of revolution coming closer. Their fate was sealed. The few soldiers guarding the palace were no match for the organized, determined Bolshevik forces. The fighting was intense, brief, and decisive. Gunshots rang through the halls, echoing off the marble floors. The walls of the Winter Palace shook under the force of revolution, And when the dust settled, the palace had fallen. The heart of the government had been seized. Lenin stood in the aftermath, the sounds of victory all around him, the old order, the regime that had ruled Russia for centuries, was gone, and in its place, something new, something powerful, something born from the struggle of the people, was rising. Lenin looked around at his comrades, his face solemn but triumphant. "We have done it," he whispered, almost to himself. "The old world is gone. A new world is being born." But even in this moment of triumph, Lenin knew the battle wasn't over. The revolution wasn't yet complete. There were still enemies to face, challenges to overcome. The road ahead would be long, hard, filled with uncertainty and danger. But this was the first step, the most important step. The Bolsheviks were in control. The people were in control. The streets of Petrograd were still, but the air crackled with the energy of change. The Winter Palace stood as a symbol of that change, once a place of absolute power, now taken by the people, by the revolutionaries who had fought for their future. Lenin, standing at the heart of it all, felt the weight of history on his shoulders, but it was a weight he was ready to carry. "This is just the beginning," he said, turning to his comrades, his voice filled with determination. "The revolution has only just begun. We must rebuild Russia from the ground up. We must create a new world, one where the people have power, where the workers control their own destiny. There will be no turning back." The Bolsheviks, still catching their breath from the battle, nodded in agreement. They had followed Lenin this far, and they would follow him further. The old order had fallen. Now, they would build something new. As the night wore on and the fires of revolution burned bright in the streets, Lenin stood tall, victorious, but not satisfied. He knew the fight wasn't over. The coup had succeeded, but the real struggle, the struggle to create a just, equal society, that was still ahead. But Lenin wasn't afraid. He had been fighting his entire life, and now, with the Bolsheviks in power, he had the chance to create the world he had always envisioned. The October night was cold, but Lenin didn't feel it. His heart burned with the heat of revolution, with the knowledge that he was at the forefront of history, that he was shaping the future of Russia. The coup had been a success. The old world had fallen. But the revolution was far from over. As the first light of dawn broke over the city, Lenin took one last look at the Winter Palace, now a symbol of their victory. "This is just the beginning," he whispered once more, his voice filled with resolve. And then, turning away from the palace, he stepped into the future, a future that he and the people would create together. Chapter 10. The Dream Realized. The revolution. Lenin's revolution had succeeded. It was almost impossible to believe, but it was true. The Tsar was gone. The empire had fallen. And the old regime, with all its cruelty and oppression, had crumbled into dust. The dream Lenin had carried with him since his youth, through years of exile, struggle, and sacrifice, had finally become reality. For the first time in history, the workers, the people, held power. Lenin stood at the forefront of this new world, a world he had fought so hard to create. The Winter Palace had fallen, the Bolsheviks had seized control, and the people, after centuries of being silenced, had finally found their voice. As Lenin looked out over the streets of Petrograd, now filled not with fear, but with hope, He allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. His dream, his vision, had been realized. But even as he stood triumphant, Lenin knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning. The hardest battles were yet to come. Russia was in chaos. The old order was gone, but the country it left behind was fractured, broken. The war with Germany had bled the nation dry. The cities were starving, the factories barely functioning, and in the countryside, the peasants, those who had supported the revolution, now waited for the promises of land and freedom to be fulfilled. And lurking behind it all, civil war loomed on the horizon. Lenin knew that the fight was far from over. As he sat in his office, surrounded by maps, reports, and endless papers, Lenin's mind raced. The challenges ahead were immense. The country was teetering on the edge of collapse. Rival factions, the Mensheviks, the socialists, the remnants of the old regime, and foreign powers, all were waiting, watching, preparing to strike at any sign of weakness. The revolution might have succeeded, but now it had to survive. The Bolsheviks, he had to be ready. Lenin's pen scratched furiously across the page. His orders were clear. The new government would need to act swiftly, decisively, if they were to hold on to power. The people must see the revolution is real, he muttered to himself. They must feel it, in every aspect of their lives. The workers' councils, the Soviets, would be the new rulers. No more monarchs, no more landlords. The power would be in the hands of the people. That was the promise. And Lenin intended to keep it. But Lenin was no fool. He knew that promises alone weren't enough. The people had fought for freedom, yes, but they also needed food, security, and stability. The economy was in ruins, the factories barely producing, the transport system collapsing. Lenin could hear the murmurs in the streets. People were growing impatient, hungry for change. They wanted results. They wanted peace. But peace, that was the one thing Lenin couldn't give them. Not yet. Civil war was inevitable. The whites, the forces loyal to the old regime, were gathering strength. They were supported by foreign powers, Britain, France, even the United States, who feared the spread of Lenin's revolution beyond Russia's borders. They would stop at nothing to crush the Bolsheviks, to restore the old order. Lenin could see it, like a storm gathering on the horizon. And so, as the country teetered on the brink, Lenin made the hardest decision of his life. "We must fight," he said, his voice firm, resolute, as he addressed the Bolshevik leadership. "There will be no peace until the revolution is secure. The people have entrusted us with their future. We cannot let them down. The Civil War, it's coming, and we must be prepared to defend what we've built, whatever the cost." The room fell silent. They all knew what Lenin meant. The revolution had been bloody, but the civil war that was coming, it would be even worse. The old world would not go quietly. It would fight tooth and nail to reclaim what had been lost. And Lenin, with his iron will, was determined to see it through. But even as he planned for the battles ahead, Lenin couldn't help but think back to the boy he had once been. The young Vladimir Ulyanov, whose world had been shattered when his brother, Alexander, was executed by the Tsar's regime. The boy who had sworn, standing at his brother's grave, that he would avenge him, that he would tear down the system that had taken his brother's life. Now, that boy, that dreamer, stood at the helm of a revolution that had changed the course of history. And yet, Lenin knew the cost of that revolution. He had seen it in the faces of the people, in the hunger that gripped the cities, in the soldiers who had fought and died for a better future. Revolution, for all its promise, came with a price. And Lenin knew that the hardest days were still to come. The Civil War would be brutal. Russia would bleed. And Lenin, with the weight of the revolution on his shoulders, would have to guide the country through it. There could be no hesitation, no doubt. The dream had been realized, but it had to be defended, or it would be lost. As Lenin sat alone in his office that night, staring at the map of Russia spread out before him, he whispered to himself, "This is what we fought for. This is what we dreamed of. And now, we fight to keep it." His voice was steady, but his mind raced with the enormity of the task ahead. The revolution was far from over. The fight was far from over. But Lenin had never been one to shy away from struggle. From the moment his brother had been taken from him, from the moment he had embraced the cause of revolution, he had known that this path would be difficult. The world wouldn't change easily. But now, standing at the crossroads of history, with the revolution finally in his hands, Lenin knew one thing for certain. He would see it through, no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice. The revolution had succeeded. But now, the battle to protect it had only just begun. Chapter 11. The Price of Power. The revolution had come, but at a terrible price. Russia, once an empire that stretched across continents, was now a country divided. The people who had marched through the streets cheering for change now found themselves at war with each other. The revolution, Lenin's revolution, had ignited something far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. Civil war had broken out, and blood, so much blood, was being spilled in the name of the cause, in the name of Lenin's dream. And yet, Lenin remained resolute. He sat in his office, surrounded by reports of battles lost and won, of cities falling to the enemy, of starvation gripping the countryside. His face, though hardened by the weight of the years, remained calm, but his eyes told a different story. Behind them was a storm. The weight of the revolution, of holding this fractured country together, was pressing down on him like never before. But Lenin, with every fiber of his being, believed. He believed that the suffering, the chaos, the pain, it was all necessary. Every sacrifice made today would be justified by the world they were building for tomorrow. The revolution, he whispered to himself, his voice low but firm, was never going to be easy, but it will be worth it. The future we are fighting for will justify the pain of the present. Outside his window, the streets of Moscow were eerily quiet. The war raged on, but here, in the heart of the new government, silence hung in the air like a ghost. The people were tired. The endless fighting had taken its toll. Families torn apart, cities reduced to rubble, hunger spreading like a plague. But Lenin couldn't allow himself to dwell on that. He had to remain focused. The dream, his dream, was still within reach. But could Russia survive the storm? The Civil War was tearing the country apart. The whites, backed by foreign powers, were relentless in their pursuit of restoring the old order. They saw the Bolsheviks not as liberators, but as destroyers, and they were determined to reclaim the Russia they had lost. Lenin knew the enemy was strong, but he also knew that the revolution was stronger. It had to be. The people, though weary, still believed in the promise of a better future. They had to. Yet, with every battle, with every casualty, the question lingered in Lenin's mind. Could he hold the country together? Could Russia, this vast and divided land, survive the revolution he had unleashed? The room was dimly lit, and Lenin leaned over the map of Russia spread across his desk. His fingers traced the lines of the front, the areas held by the Bolsheviks, the territories still controlled by the Whites. The Civil War had turned brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. The cost of power was high, and Lenin could feel its weight bearing down on him. Is this the price? He thought. Is this what it takes to build a new world? He looked at the reports, the casualty numbers, the letters from soldiers on the front lines. They spoke of hunger, of cold, of fighting that seemed endless, but they also spoke of hope, of a belief in the revolution. The workers, the peasants, the soldiers, they were still fighting, still willing to bleed for the future Lenin had promised them. But even Lenin could not ignore the reality before him. The revolution had brought chaos, suffering, and death. And for many, the dream of a better future seemed farther away than ever. He had always known that change would come at a cost, but now, as Russia teetered on the brink of collapse, the full extent of that cost was becoming clear. The door to his office creaked open, and one of his closest comrades entered, his face lined with exhaustion. "Comrade Lenin," he said quietly, "the situation is worsening in the south. The Whites are advancing. We've lost contact with several of our units. The people, they're starting to lose faith." Lenin didn't flinch. He had expected this. He had been preparing for it. But hearing those words, "the people were losing faith," cut deeper than any battlefield report ever could. The revolution wasn't just a political movement. It was a belief, a promise of something better. And if the people lost faith in that promise, then everything would crumble. "We can't let that happen," Lenin said, his voice quiet but filled with steel. "The people must know that we are fighting for them. They must know that the future we are building is worth the sacrifices they are making today. We cannot falter. We cannot fail." But even as he spoke those words, Lenin knew the reality of the situation. The revolution was hanging by a thread. The country was starving, the soldiers were exhausted, and the enemy was closing in. The dream of a new world, a world where the workers held power, where the people were free, was slipping away with every passing day. And yet, Lenin couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He stood up, his hands gripping the edges of the desk, his eyes burning with the same fire that had driven him since his youth. "The future," he whispered, more to himself than to his comrade, "is within our grasp. But we must be willing to pay the price." The price of power had always been high. Lenin had known that from the start. But now, as he looked out at a country ravaged by war, as he listened to the reports of people losing hope, he began to wonder, how much higher would that price go? How much more blood would be spilled in the name of the revolution? Could Russia survive? The silence in the room was suffocating, but Lenin's mind was already racing ahead. The fight was far from over. The Civil War was tearing the country apart, but he believed, with every fiber of his being, that they could still win. They had to. The future of the revolution depended on it. And so, even as Russia burned, even as the dream seemed to slip further and further away, Lenin remained resolute. The price of power was steep, but the future, his future, the future of the people, would justify it all. It had to. Chapter 12. Legacy of a Revolutionary. The years of revolution had taken their toll. Lenin, the man who had once seemed unstoppable, now found himself confined to a small, quiet room, far from the battles, far from the roaring crowds. His body, once fueled by the fire of revolution, was failing him. The weight of leadership, the endless strain of guiding a country through war, chaos, and transformation had worn him down. The revolution had triumphed. But at what cost? His health, fragile for months, was slipping away. The strokes had left him weakened, unable to speak with the force and conviction that had once shaken the walls of the Winter Palace. His hands, once steady as they wrote the words that sparked revolutions, now trembled. But his mind remained sharp, his vision, his dream, unwavering. Even now, as his body betrayed him, Lenin's thoughts were consumed with the future. The revolution he had fought for, the Russia he had reshaped, what would become of it? Would it stand the test of time? Or would it crumble, like so many empires before it? These questions gnawed at him as he lay in the stillness, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts drifting back to where it had all begun. He thought of his childhood, of the boy who had grown up in a land ruled by an iron-fisted czar, the boy who had watched his brother, Alexander, executed for daring to dream of change, the boy who had sworn at his brother's grave that he would continue the fight, that he would make the world see the injustice. And he had done it. He had torn down the czar's regime, dismantled the old order, and led the workers, the peasants, to power. He had done what so many had thought impossible. But now, in these final days, as the weight of all he had accomplished pressed down on him, Lenin couldn't help but wonder. Was it enough? His thoughts swirled, shifting between past and present. The revolution had changed Russia and the world. His vision of a society ruled by the workers, where power belonged to the people, had come to life. But the cost? Oh, the cost had been so high. Civil war, famine, executions. Blood had been spilled in the name of the cause, in his name. Will they remember me as a hero? He thought, his mind heavy with the weight of the question. Or as a tyrant? The uncertainty haunted him. He had always known the revolution would be violent, that the old order wouldn't fall without a fight. But now, as he lay in the stillness of his final days, he wondered, had he done enough to secure the future he had promised? Or had the violence, the suffering, overshadowed the dream? He thought of the people he had fought for, the workers, the peasants, the ones who had given everything to see the revolution succeed. Would they remember him as the leader who had given them hope? Or would they see him as just another ruler, another man who had promised change but delivered suffering? His comrades visited him, speaking in hushed tones, their faces etched with concern. They reassured him, told him that the revolution was strong, that the Bolsheviks were in control. But Lenin, ever the visionary, could see further. He could see the cracks forming, the rivalries brewing. He could sense the power struggles that would come after him. What will become of Russia? He wondered, his thoughts drifting as he stared out the window. The snow-covered streets of Moscow, silent and still, seemed so far away now. The noise of revolution, the energy of the people, it was all a distant memory. He had reshaped Russia, yes, but at what cost? Could the country survive without him? Could the revolution endure? Lenin's mind wandered back to his youth, the early days, when the dream had been pure, when the fight had seemed so clear. He remembered the secret meetings, the excitement of planning, the thrill of writing words that would inspire millions. But those days, they were long gone. The revolution was no longer just an idea. It was reality, and reality was far more complicated. As his strength faded, Lenin thought about the future he had fought so hard to create, the world he had envisioned, a world free from oppression, where the workers ruled, where equality reigned. It was a world he had glimpsed, but would never fully see. The path ahead for Russia was uncertain, and Lenin, for all his brilliance, could not control what would happen after he was gone. Would his comrades carry on his vision? Would they remain true to the cause? Or would they be corrupted by power, as so many had before them? These were the questions that filled Lenin's final days. The revolution had succeeded, but would it survive? His body, weak and frail, lay still, but his mind raced. He could see the faces of the people he had fought for, the workers in the factories, the peasants in the fields. Would they remember him as the man who had given them a voice, or as the man who had led them into endless struggle? History will judge me, Lenin thought, his breathing slow, his voice barely a whisper. But history is always written by those in power. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him. The battles, the victories, the losses. It had all been for this. The revolution had reshaped the world. His dream, once a distant vision, had become reality. But now, in these final moments, Lenin couldn't help but wonder, at what cost? As the darkness closed in, Lenin's final thoughts were not of power or glory or even victory. They were of the people, the workers, the peasants, the millions who had placed their faith in the revolution. Would they remember him as the man who had fought for their future? Or would they see him as just another ruler, another leader who had promised change, but left behind only suffering? In the stillness of his final breath, Lenin whispered to himself, "The revolution was never about me. It was about them. It was always about them." And with that, Vladimir Lenin, the man who had reshaped Russia, who had changed the course of history, was gone.